Today we have a story about a forgotten mercy, buried deep in the quiet soil of history, where a single act of courage refused to stay hidden. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing and becoming part of our community. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from our amazing viewers all around the world. What follows was recovered from a brittle ledger found in a county archive long after the ink had faded. It tells of a small town in rural Georgia, where the road bent away from the main track and life moved at the slow, watchful pace of survival. The girl at the center of this record was named Grace Walker. She was young, scarcely past childhood, yet already worn thin by labor and silence. Each morning she rose before the sun, tying her shoes with careful knots, helping her aunt with washing and water, then walking the long path toward the mill grounds where scraps of work could be found. She had a soft way about her, quiet, observant, kind without being careless. People noticed her only when she was useful, which suited her well enough. The town was ruled not by law but by custom. The mill supervisor, Mr. Harold Boone, carried himself like a man appointed by heaven itself. His rules were spoken low but enforced hard. No wandering past certain trees, no questions about missing workers, no prayers spoken too loudly after dark. Grace learned early that obedience did not guarantee safety, only invisibility. Behind the mill lay an unused stretch of forest, officially declared off-limits. Boone called it dangerous ground. He said snakes lived there. He said bad men hid there. He said nothing good ever came from stepping past the boundary posts nailed into the soil. Grace noticed things others did not. Chains delivered without record. Tools that vanished and returned rusted. Birds that refused to settle near one particular clearing. And once, just once, a sound carried on the wind that did not belong to the forest. A sound like metal shifting, slow and patient, as though something was waiting. At the boarding house where Grace slept, rules were written and rewritten without reason. Lights out earlier each week, doors locked from the outside. Prayer meetings mandatory, questions forbidden. Boone's eyes followed her longer than necessary, not with desire, with calculation. The record notes that on an afternoon thick with heat and silence, Grace stepped past the boundary post for the first time. She would later say she did not know why, only that something beneath the ground had begun to call her name. The second entry in the archive is marked only with a date and the word incident, written in a careful hand that suggested fear of discovery. Grace Walker did not mean to disobey. That much the record makes clear. She had gone toward the forest path carrying an empty pail, following the same route she had walked since childhood. But the mill bell rang early that day, sharp and wrong, and the workers scattered like startled birds. In the confusion, Grace found herself standing near the boundary post Boone had warned them about. Mr. Boone appeared as though summoned by her hesitation. He did not raise his voice. He never did. He asked why her pail was empty. He asked why she stood where she stood. His words were gentle, but the space around him felt colder, tighter, like a room with the windows sealed. Grace answered politely. She always did. She said she had been told to fetch water. She said she would return at once. She lowered her eyes, hands folded, posture respectful. Boone smiled. The smile was not cruel. That was what unsettled her. It was measured, almost satisfied. He told her the well was closed for the afternoon. He told her she had been mistaken. He told her mistakes had consequences. In front of the others, he assigned her to scrub the mill floor alone after sundown. No lamp, no assistance. He said it was for discipline. He said it was for her own good. No one protested. The mill had learned silence the way skin learns scars. That evening, Grace worked until her hands burned and her knees ached. The light faded, replaced by long shadows that crept across the boards like living things. She heard sounds beneath the floor, not rats, not pipes, something slower, heavier, rhythmic. When she finished, Boone inspected her work with care. He pointed out places already clean and said they were not enough. He told her she lacked attention. He told her she lacked gratitude. Before dismissing her, he leaned close and whispered a rule she had never heard before. Some places exist so that others may never be found. Grace did not understand the meaning then, but she felt it settle into her bones. As she left, she noticed something small by the doorway. A length of chain dragged across the floor, leaving a dark line that did not fade when wiped. Boone followed her gaze and calmly nudged the chain out of sight with his boot. That night in the boarding house, Grace dreamed of trees that breathed, and when she woke, her hands smelled faintly of iron. The third entry grows less orderly, as though the person recording it no longer trusted time to move in a straight line. After the incident at the mill, rules multiplied without notice. Paths Grace had walked for years were suddenly forbidden. Tasks she once shared were reassigned so she worked alone. Whispers followed her, not loud enough to confront, but close enough to feel. People stopped meeting her eyes. Even prayer felt watched. Mr. Boone began appearing where Grace did not expect him, by the well at dawn, by the boarding house door at dusk. He never accused her of anything. Instead, he reminded her of things she already knew. Some doors stay closed for a reason. Some questions make people disappear. Some kindnesses cost more than they give. Grace listened. She nodded. She obeyed. Yet the forest pulled at her thoughts like a tide that would not retreat. It was Evelyn Price, the church laundress, who first noticed the change. Evelyn was older, her hair streaked with gray, her hands strong from years of work. She spoke little, but her eyes missed nothing. One evening, as Grace folded linen beside her, Evelyn pressed a warm cup into her hands without looking over. "You walk lighter now," Evelyn murmured. "Like you are trying not to wake something." Grace said nothing. Silence had become habit. But when she glanced up, Evelyn met her gaze, steady, knowing, unafraid. Strange things followed. The mill ledger began to lose names. Workers remembered faces that no longer matched the records. A locked storage room beneath the mill let out a low sound at night, not constant, but patterned. 3 pauses, 1 scrape, then stillness. Grace heard it while sweeping late, her broom trembling as the sound traveled through wood and bone alike. She began to notice marks on the ground near the forbidden path. Dragged lines, pressed footprints too deep to belong to any living thing she knew. Once she found a scrap of cloth caught on a thorn, dark, torn, stiff with age. When she showed it to Evelyn, the older woman did not ask where it came from. She only said, "Some truths do not want light. That does not mean they deserve darkness." The pressure grew. Boone reassigned Grace to deliver supplies near the forest edge, always watched, always corrected. He spoke kindly while tightening the rules. He praised obedience while isolating her further. One night, Grace passed the locked room and heard her name spoken, not aloud, but carried in the wood itself, low and aching. She did not answer, but she stopped pretending the sound was her imagination. The final line of the entry reads, "When the ground begins to remember, someone must listen." The fourth entry is written with firmer strokes, as though the hand that held the pen had finally decided to stand its ground. The line was crossed on a Sunday. Grace had gone to church as she always did, sitting near the back, hands folded, voice low in hymn. The sermon spoke of order and obedience, of knowing one's place in the design of the world. Mr. Boone sat in the front pew, head bowed, lips moving in prayer that sounded practiced rather than felt. When the service ended, Boone did not leave. He waited until the benches emptied, until only Grace, Evelyn, and the minister remained. Then he asked Grace to stay behind. His tone was gentle, his authority absolute. He told her the boarding house contract was being reviewed. He said there were concerns. He said people had noticed her wandering thoughts, her misplaced curiosity. He spoke as though worry, not threat, guided him. "You have been seen near places that trouble follows," he said. "That is not fitting for a girl who wishes to remain here." Grace felt the room narrow. The air grew heavy, as if the walls leaned closer to listen. Boone offered her a choice. She could accept reassignment to a distant estate owned by his cousin, far from the town, far from anyone who knew her name, or she could be turned out entirely. No room, no work, no protection. Evelyn's fingers tightened on the back of the pew. Grace's throat burned, but she did not raise her voice. She did not beg. She asked only one question. "What lies beyond the boundary?" The silence that followed was not empty. Boone's face changed then, not with anger but with fear he could not hide quickly enough. His hand clenched. The minister suddenly found great interest in the floorboards. "That place is not for you," Boone said. "It is not for anyone. It is kept for a reason." Grace understood in that moment what had been circling her since the first sound beneath the mill. Whatever was hidden was not a thing of the past. It was ongoing, maintained, fed by silence. She declined the reassignment. Boone leaned close enough that she smelled iron and cold earth on his coat. He told her she would regret pride. He told her rules protected those who followed them. That night, Grace returned to the boarding house to find her belongings moved. Her bed reassigned, her name scratched from the board. Evelyn met her at the door and said nothing. She only placed a hand over Grace's heart and nodded once. Later, alone in the dark, Grace heard the forest call again, not with sound, but with weight. She realized then that whatever was buried was not asking to be saved. It was asking to be seen. The fifth entry is marked with a pressed leaf, flattened between the pages, as though the writer wished to remember where courage first took root. Grace Walker did not flee the town, though Boone clearly expected her to. Instead, she stayed very still. She slept on a pallet beside Evelyn's washroom, rising before dawn, moving softly, listening more than speaking. If Boone watched her, she gave him nothing to read. Fear, she learned, could be shaped into patience. She began by learning the rules that were never written, which men carried keys, which doors were locked only for show, which paths were avoided not because they were dangerous, but because they remembered too much. She learned that Boone kept old records in the mill office, bound with twine and dust, never shown to inspectors. She learned that the forest boundary was not chosen for safety, but for distance, far enough that cries would dissolve into trees. Evelyn helped in the only way she could. She never asked questions, but she left doors ajar, misplaced cloth, delayed others with quiet errands. Once, she slipped Grace a folded scrap torn from a hymn book, inside which was written a single sentence. The land was never meant to keep secrets forever. Grace waited for rain. On an evening when thunder pressed low against the sky, she followed the forbidden path again, her dress darkened, her steps erased by mud. The forest accepted her without sound. She moved toward the clearing she had dreamed of since the mill floor night. There she found proof. Chains worn smooth by time, marks in the bark of an old tree, deep and patient as though something had leaned there too long. Beneath the roots, wrapped in oilcloth, a ledger sealed with wax, names not recorded at the mill, dates that did not match any burial record, notations written in Boone's careful hand. Grace did not open it there. Some truths she understood needed walls to echo within. Boone sensed the change almost immediately. He spoke more sharply. He checked locks twice. He reminded everyone of order and consequence. Yet he smiled when he passed Grace, convinced her smallness made her harmless. He was wrong. Grace did not plan to fight him with noise or force. She planned to fight him with what men like Boone feared most: memory made visible. That night she hid the ledger beneath the church floor, where prayers soaked into wood older than Boone's authority. Hope rose, fragile but real, and with it came dread. Because Grace now knew the truth, and the truth had not finished with her. The sixth entry bears the marks of urgency. The ink is darker, pressed hard into the page, as though time itself had begun to close in. Grace chose a morning when the town gathered by habit rather than command. It was the day the circuit inspector arrived, a quiet man named Daniel Morris, sent to review mill conditions and church accounts. Boone had spoken of him often, always with polite dismissal. Federal men came and went, Boone said. Papers could be managed, questions could be redirected. Grace waited until the meeting hall filled. She stood near the back, hands folded, heart steady. Evelyn remained close, her presence like a stone at Grace's spine. When the inspector asked if there were any concerns to be raised, Boone answered quickly, smoothly, listing figures and improvements, speaking of order restored after difficult years. His voice carried confidence born of repetition. Grace stepped forward, the room shifted. It was subtle, a tightening of breath, a change in posture, but it happened all the same. Boone turned, surprise flickering across his face before discipline reclaimed it. Grace spoke softly. She did not accuse, she did not shout. She said only that records were missing, that names had been erased, that labor had ended without explanation. She placed the ledger on the table. The sound it made was small, but it carried. Boone laughed once, sharp and false. He said the girl was mistaken. He said grief and imagination made poor companions. He said the book was old, irrelevant, misinterpreted. But Daniel Morris opened it. The room grew quiet as pages turned. Dates did not align. Signatures repeated where no witnesses were listed. Payments recorded without recipients. Notes written in Boone's own careful hand, never meant for light. Boone spoke faster then. He blamed war confusion. He blamed clerks long gone. He blamed the land itself. Grace said nothing more. She did not need to. Murmurs rose. Someone recognized a name. Someone else remembered a brother who never returned from mill duty. The silence Boone had cultivated for years began to fracture. The inspector closed the ledger slowly. Boone's hand trembled. He wiped it on his coat and forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. He insisted the matter be handled privately. Daniel Morris disagreed. By evening, Boone was no longer giving orders. He was answering questions. That night the forest was restless. Wind moved through branches without pattern. Something old shifted beneath the soil as though a long-held breath had finally been released. Grace lay awake, knowing this was only the beginning. When power begins to fall, it does not do so quietly. It pulls everything down with it. The seventh entry is written in a hand both calm and unyielding, as if the writer understood that fear had finally changed sides. The reckoning came not at the mill, but in the church. Word had spread faster than Boone expected. By Sunday, the benches were full, not with hymn books open, but with eyes watching. Daniel Morris stood near the pulpit, ledger in hand. The minister remained silent, his authority swallowed by something larger than doctrine. Boone arrived late. His coat was pressed. His face was pale. He smiled as he always had, but the smile trembled at the edges. When he took his place at the front, he did not kneel. Morris spoke first. He read names aloud, slow, deliberate, allowing each to settle into the room. With every name, a memory surfaced. A missing worker. A brother sent into the woods. A man who never returned from night duty. When Morris reached the final page, Boone stood. He said the girl had been confused. He said the forest twisted stories. He said order required sacrifice. His voice rose, sharp now, stripped of polish. He spoke of danger, of necessary measures, of keeping peace in difficult times. Grace stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She described the chains. She described the tree with bark worn smooth by weight and time. She described the rules that changed without reason, the names that vanished, the sound beneath the mill floor that followed a pattern too steady to be chance. As she spoke, Boone's breathing grew uneven. Then Grace said the final thing. She said the ledger was not complete. She explained that some names had never been written because they were never meant to be remembered at all. At that, Boone broke. He shouted that the past could not be undone. He said survival required harshness. He said the land demanded it. The room did not answer him. The inspector ordered Boone detained pending inquiry. The word detained hung in the air like a verdict already decided. As Boone was led away, the wind pressed against the church doors. The building groaned, wood settling, as if acknowledging something long denied. Later, when men followed Grace to the forest clearing, they found the tree. They found the chains. And beneath the roots they found bones arranged with care as though the earth itself had tried to protect what was left. No one spoke. The record notes that birds returned to the clearing within days. And that night, the mill floor was silent for the first time in years. But the most chilling detail was written in the margin. Boone wept not for the dead, but because they had finally been heard. The final entry is written in lighter ink, as though the hand that recorded it no longer feared interruption. The town did not celebrate. There were no bells, no songs of victory. Justice, when it comes late, arrives quietly. Mr. Boone was removed from his position and taken away under supervision. The record does not follow him beyond that point. Some names are not worth tracing once their power is gone. The mill closed for a season. The boarding house rules were rewritten, this time in daylight, read aloud where all could hear them. The forest path was no longer forbidden, but few chose to walk it. The tree remained standing. It always would. Some things are not meant to be erased, only acknowledged. Grace Walker stayed. She returned to ordinary work, to carrying water and folding linen, to rising before the sun. But the town now made space for her presence. People listened when she spoke. They remembered names out loud. Evelyn continued her washing, though her back bent more each year. She never spoke of what she had helped protect, but when Grace passed, she nodded with a knowing smile. Daniel Morris returned once more before winter. He sealed the ledger and marked it for permanent record. In the margin of the final page, he wrote a single sentence. Truth, once named, refuses burial. Years later, children would ask why the mill floor no longer made sounds at night. Adults would answer carefully, choosing words like history and consequence. No one mentioned fear. Grace never married, she never sought attention. Her strength remained what it had always been: quiet, steady, undeniable. When asked why she spoke up when others stayed silent, she answered simply that she listened when something called. The archive ends with a note added long after Grace's passing. It states that the tree still stands, that birds nest there without unease, that the ground no longer shifts at night, and that in towns like this, salvation did not come from force or fire, but from a girl who refused to look away. Some stories survive not because they are loud, but because someone gentle carried them into the light.